Now I continue on in Galatians chapter number 1, and I've made it down to verse number 10. For do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ. Paul goes on in verse number 11. But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man, for I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. For ye have heard of my conversation time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. I will stop reading there. In verse number 10, after Paul points out and states that the gospel that he has preached, if another man comes along and preaches another message, let him be anathema. And when you add, as the Judaizers did, when you add anything to the grace of God, in their case, they were adding the matter of law keeping to the operation of the grace of God. When you add anything to the grace of God ceases to be grace. You can add grace to Mosaic law, and you'll still have Mosaic law. But if you add Mosaic law to the grace of God, you no longer have the grace of God. You have Mosaic law. The grace of God must stand alone. And that's why Paul re-emphasizes on 2 occasions. He says, but though we are an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so say I now again. If any man preach any other gospel unto you than that ye have received, let him be accursed. Twice he points out that a man altering, perverting, changing the matter of the grace of God, let that man be accursed. In other words, let him die and go to hell. That would pervert the gospel of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Now Paul develops this in verse number 10, which is where I pick up now. Paul says, for do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Jesus Christ. Do I persuade men or God? Do I please men or God? We have 2 P's here. The matter of persuading and the matter of pleasing. The object of the keeping of the law was in its aspect an area of pleasing men. And this matter of men pleasing very quickly becomes a matter of legalism. There are many men that are totally occupied with what do the brethren think. Social media, Facebook and Twitter, has given itself to a matter of men pleasing. And there is now competition among men as to who can remain in the closest favor. Some men claim to be independent when they're the farthest thing from being independent, because they are completely and entirely in the throes of the circle of men that they fellowship with. And they'll not preach anything. They may understand something from the Bible, but they'll not preach that, not with power and liberty, because some of the brethren, quote unquote, are in disagreement with it. And though they themselves say, I see the truth of that, they would sit on that truth and not declare that truth and not proclaim that truth, because it might put them at odds and put them in a bad light with, quote unquote, the brethren. Now, they're not independent at all. They are in bondage, complete and total bondage to their brethren. That enters into an area of man-pleasing. I wouldn't deliberately, on purpose, offend anyone listening to the Bright Spot Hour today by my conduct, by my demeanor, my language, my behavior. I would not deliberately offend anyone that is hearing the Bright Spot Hour now. I'll be preaching in just a little while, as I'm recording this broadcast in just a few hours. I'll be standing in a pulpit a couple of states away from South Carolina, laboring in word and in doctrine. I'm anticipating the congregation gathering in now. You couldn't pay me enough money to do anything in the meeting tonight that would be a rock of offense or a stone of stumbling to anyone in that congregation. But at the same time, I will not compromise Bible truth, rightly divided, rightly understood from a King James Bible, for anyone in attendance in my meeting tonight. Last night in my meeting, and I preached right down the line. But in my meeting, we had 3 or 4, maybe 5 different churches that were represented. And we had, of course, the church that I was in. Then we had a visiting choir come in. And then we had other church members come in. We had some folk there from that were Methodist. And I had a couple of people there that were from a community church. And I wouldn't have done anything to offend anyone in that building by my language, by my conduct, by my deportment. I wouldn't have embarrassed a person in that building. But in preaching Bible truth, and I preached straight down the line last night, right out of the Bible, verse by verse and line by line, right out of 1 Thessalonians and chapter number 4, right down the line. And if preaching Bible truth becomes a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, they'll just have to be offended. Paul said, do I persuade men or God? Do I please men or God? It is a tragedy. It is a tragedy of tragedies that among self-professed Bible believers, we have men that will not preach the truth because they are fearful of what their alma mater, where they went to school and earned their theology degree, what they might say, or what the brethren, the men that they run with, and they get to preach. You'll go over and preach in this brother's pulpit, and then that pastor come over and preach, and they swap pulpits back and forth, and it keeps them busy going about, and they hold meetings and little conferences together, and the same 4 or 5 men will always be preaching in all their little conferences. And he may say, now I believe this in the Bible, but I know brother so-and-so doesn't. And so as a result of that, I can't preach this because it might offend brother so-and-so. And we've got these conferences lined up down the road. That's men pleasing. Paul said, do I persuade men or God? Do I please men or God? Now what about this matter of persuade? Do I persuade God? Persuade is from the Greek word pytho. And the word does not imply an aggressive power of persuasion. It doesn't imply something overt or outward or outlandish. Rather, it is a complicit conciliation. It is a conciliation to pacify and to win one over. This word, pytho, translated persuaded here in the text, is also translated in the King James Bible as obeyed, having made, having confidence, trust, shall, assure, and then of course, as in my text, persuade. It is to induce or persuade one to follow you or to join you. When Paul states the matter of persuasion, the reference is to persuading men or God. Do I persuade men or do I persuade God? But in the light of this matter of persuasion, Paul brings up the matter of pleasing. So the persuading men or God could not be very far removed from the matter of pleasing men or pleasing God. The old adage that honey draws more flies than vinegar. And this, when Paul says, do I persuade men, do I now persuade men, it is a complicit conciliation. It is a pacifying to win men over to your side. do I persuade men or God? Now, in the final analysis, every one of us that labor in word and in doctrine are going to have to make up our mind, are we going to please mammon or are we going to please God? There comes a point in time when the decision is mutually exclusive. If I please God, then I'll not be able to please men. If I go with God, then I'll not be able to go with men. We arrive at these decisions. Do I persuade men or do I persuade God? And I recognize that conflict and divisions are not a very pleasant thing, and that you and I want to avoid all the conflict we possibly can. The Lord knows there's enough conflict in the world. Why would I want to stir up conflict when there's enough of it I already have to deal with in the course of my life? But if you and I live, there's going to come a point in time when we're going to be forced to deal with the matter of conflict. And we will be forced to decide, do I please men or do I please God at this particular point? By the grace of God, I'll be back again on the program tomorrow.
Greenville, South Carolina 29602.